much for joining us, Jess. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we get into the career side of things?
Sure. I'm Jess Ralston. I am from the Northwest originally, so I'm very pleased to be back here with you today. I studied geology at uni when I obviously was 18, and that first got me going on the energy side of things. But truth be told, I've always been interested because I've always thought that energy in particular has a big role to play with much of the world. And it's interesting because I remember when we first, it's a bit of an aside, but when we first went into the Iraq and Iran war and things like that, and I realised that was all to do with oil and gas, really.
Yeah.
And that had a huge control over not just wars and things, but also the global economy. And especially over the past couple of years, anyone who's paid a gas bill knows just what oil and gas prices have done to the cost of living and energy bills. So I think energy as a whole is such a fundamental part of everyday life that we don't even think about sometimes.
Yeah, that's true.
And that first got me interested in the oil and gas energy world. And then I found myself here today.
And it's a big leap.
Yeah.
But so why geology then? Was it geology because of those factors, or was geology a particular interest before those factors?
A bit of both. So I was interested in it because of the global impacts that it had. And I was also interested in it because I studied at school, did an A-level in it, and I liked it better than geography, purely because it was a little bit more science-based.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean, geography can be human and physical, whereas geology was like the pure science behind things. And that got me interested. I had a great teacher at school, and I just really enjoyed learning about all the different parts of the natural world, if you like. I mean, I'm big on like the outdoors, nature, walks in the Lake District. You know, I grew up doing that because my granddad had a caravan there. So I've always been an outdoorsy type. And yeah, the idea of studying rocks might not sound exciting to some, but no, it was good.
And it does have such a huge link, doesn't it? I think they say that maybe the instant thought of geology is the studying of rocks. But
there's a lot of that.
Yeah. But to be honest, I think the first time I kind of came across it with a link to renewables was we were doing a ground source heat pump project with boreholes. So there's obviously the geological surveys that you need to do. And we came across a project where we got told if we drilled down anywhere more than like 25 meters, there was the chance of hitting, correct me if I'm using the wrong terminology, an artesian well, where if we'd have hit it, the water would have carried on pouring out for, until this well was empty, which could have taken a long time.
Yeah.
We're like, okay, we'll probably go for air source on this one, I think. But it's got that aspect in terms of, what can we do? And there's other countries doing it far better than us, taking energy from the ground, from a renewable source and utilising that. I think Iceland probably leading the way in that world. And then, the flip side and then what feels now like such a negative side, as you mentioned, going into wars where maybe that is a driver to extract that black gold, the oil from those places. And then you consider maybe the hold Russia has over the world in terms of their gas reserves and the impact then that has on people in everyday lives now, where we're certainly seeing the negative side of it, obviously with energy prices going up and how reliant we were on cheap gas. But then you also look at places like Norway, who have absolutely benefited from the situation by selling gas to places like the UK after decarbonising, electrifying their home. So it's definitely more than just the studying of rocks.
I like to think so, yeah. I like to think I didn't waste all that money just studying rocks. But no, it's interesting what you said there about, we've been reliant on cheap gas, and we have because we've had the North Sea. When that first opened, I think it was in the 60s, we got that glut of gas and oil as well later on. And we have relied on that, and that's why 85% of our homes have gas boilers, and we use it for about 40% of our gas generation still. But the reality is that it won't last forever. It's not a secret that the North Sea is running out, and there's no one really disputing that, even the oil and gas companies. And it's a question now of where we're going to get that energy from in future, because the North Sea is not going to last forever. We're going to have to diversify. And increasingly places like Qatar and obviously the Middle East, we're getting a lot of gas from there. The US is now a big export market for gas, particularly over COVID and Joe Biden's presidency. There's been a lot more of exporting LNG. So it's going to change whether we have net zero climate change policies or not. where we get our energy from will change, and it either changes to things like getting more imports of gas, or it changes to relying on British electricity from wind farms and things. And that's a political choice. But it's also an economical one, because as we've seen, oil and gas prices will always be volatile. Whereas British electricity, we haven't got loads of it yet, but we're going to have more control over the prices of that than we are of the global markets.
And we've got a huge opportunity to generate as well.
Yeah. I mean, we're an island, aren't we? We've got all this offshore wind, wave and tidal. That's something I'm really interested in. I actually did a master's in oceanography, and I focused a lot on tidal energy. And it's obviously, we're in Merseyside now, that the Mersey Lagoon and the tidal barrage and things like that, Wales as well, Scotland. We've got a huge opportunity, and it really depends on what we do now as to where we get our energy from in 10, 20, 30 years' time.
And what is the maybe getting into the political side of it? Well, sorry, let's do the company you're working for now.
Yes, so I work at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. I forgot then. But we're a non-profit organisation, fully philanthropically funded, which is always difficult to say. So we get our money from philanthropic sources, so we don't have any vested interests in any sort of technology over another. And we work mainly with the media and politicians to help them understand energy and climate issues, because, as everyone will know, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Some of it's disinformation on purpose from certain vested interests. But also there's just a lot of confusion about politics, policy, and what's actually happening with these various energy and climate issues. So I work on everything from power generation in the UK, so oil and gas, renewables, through to people's homes and heating. And every now and again, I talk about industry, but it's not my area of expertise.
It's. I think the political part of it is a huge driver to one of the reasons why we're in the position we are in the UK. But I think that understanding those drivers, because I suppose the first question I had for you really was, when we talk about these opportunities for energy generation, and I think back to probably the biggest one that I saw whilst being in the industry was when the Conservatives kind of banned onshore wind. And I heard various different reasons for that from a lot of people who were voting Conservatives were in areas where, they had, views of beautiful hills, and they didn't want, their view spoiling, through to the fact that we had so much generation, but actually there wasn't anywhere to put it. So it was more of a practical decision of, why do we keep generating it when we haven't got the adoption for it, through to energy storage solutions and the fact that we didn't have the ability to store the energy we're generating to use it when we need it. Are you able to shed any light on that? What are the reasons why maybe the UK isn't moving as fast, or are we moving as fast as other countries?
I think that's a good question, because in some areas we have moved very quickly, and I'm thinking there specifically about offshore wind. So I think we've got the second largest offshore wind market in the world after China, and that's because we've had over 10 years, I think now, of things like the renewables obligation and contracts for difference, which are the government, well, people call them subsidy schemes, but they're actually more schemes of price stability these days. But in the early days, yes, they were subsidy schemes to get that market up and running and get those supply chains off the ground. And they've worked really well, where now we do have lots of offshore wind, and that really helps us to have a diverse energy mix and make sure that we're not completely reliant on things like oil and gas. But then, as you say, with decisions like David Cameron's government in, I think, 2015, 2016 to ban onshore wind, that was done as a political choice, right? Because they were getting complaints from various people about onshore wind, as you said. But actually, when you look at the public opinion polling, onshore wind has always been actually very popular. And it's a very small but vocal minority that have these articles in the press, or they have direct lines into Number 10, who are saying basically everyone's against this, when actually the polls show that actually most people are for it. And I think in recent years, decisions that we've taken in the past, and not only things like onshore wind, but also Centrica, who are the owner of British Gas, they took a decision around a similar time, I think, to close down the Rough gas storage facility. And that's meant that we don't have as much gas storage as places across Europe do. And over the past couple of years, that plus the decisions on onshore wind have meant that we've been very exposed to the volatility in the oil and gas markets. And so those decisions from 10 or so years ago have impacts today. And And I'd like to think that we've learned our lessons from them. And obviously the new government has actually lifted the ban on onshore wind. So I think many people are now hoping that we'll see more being built. But I think, back then, there's big questions now about whether back then that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And it was it was one of the early decisions that the Labour government made, wasn't it, when they came to lift that ban. And there's still challenges in that journey around planning and connection to the grid, but it does seem to be that if we can really start to double down on our own generation and support the electrification of our energy usage. Obviously, coming from a background in heat pumps, it's always one that I can't quite. I can see why we've got this issue around people deciding to make that switch, especially when you consider gas prices and electricity prices are so intrinsically linked, and with the best will in the world, if you get a heat pump that's 300% efficient, you're paying roughly 3 times the amount for gas. I know it's not quite as black and white as that, but that's kind of the equation that gets kicked around. But do you see a world where the subsidies and the levies and the taxation, if you like, that goes onto electricity prices starting to be pulled away and starting to maybe incentivize electricity usage more to make that a more compelling argument?
100%. So actually, we're approaching the tipping point on the very early renewable subsidies. So the renewables obligation was the first renewable subsidy that was put onto electricity bills. And we're actually reaching the point now where those contracts, because they were made so long ago, are actually running out. So we'll soon reach the point where those legacy costs start to fall off. And they're replaced by the contracts for difference scheme, which is a very difficult scheme to explain because it's pretty complicated and weird. But basically, with the contracts for difference scheme, generators who receive subsidies sometimes will also pay back to consumers sometimes.
Okay.
And over the past couple of years, when gas prices have been so high, actually the renewable electricity companies have been paying us back directly on our bills. It's not been much. It's been about 50, 20 quid a year per household. So it doesn't seem that significant. But when you add that up over the 28 million households, that becomes hundreds of millions of pounds.
Yeah.
So I think we're soon reaching the point where those legacy costs will start to decrease. And as we've hinted at, the price of gas is going down, but it's not at the level that it was pre-crisis, and some people think it will never be back to that level. So we're reaching the point where the contracts for difference scheme is either going to break even, or there'll be a very small subsidy or a very small paying back to consumers. So it's almost going to be negligible in cost and potentially even a benefit. But not only that, as I think you mentioned levies as well. With the levies on electricity, it's about 4 times more on electricity than it is on gas. And in a world where gas is obviously bad for climate change, it's not a very stable commodity, and the energy independence angle that lots of politicians are keen to talk about, that will depend on reducing gas usage. So it's a bit of a backwards incentive at the moment to have so much more tax on electricity bills than compared to gas. And that's something that the government will have to get to grips with if it wants to see more people move over to electrified heat, electrified vehicles. It's going to have to address electricity costs. But it's a more long-term policy change, because especially at the moment, people are really out of pocket. They haven't got any savings left after the cost of living crisis. And that's continuing, of course. And trying to get them to switch across to things which are more expensive up front is a bit of an ask. And lowering those upfront costs will be incredibly important as well.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. It would take a very brave government to essentially try and shift those levies over to gas, and then 80% of the UK households are reliant on natural gas.
But Ed Miliband is someone who I think he is very keen to get these long-term policy changes done early on in the term of this government, because they've just won a huge majority. They've got a huge mandate to deliver on a lot on the energy promises that they made during the election. And I think Ed Miliband is somebody who does see that long-term picture. I mean, he's worked in the energy space for years and years and years. But it's just a question really of whether the Treasury and Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves also see it that way as an opportunity, or whether they see that as a more of a political challenge.
Yeah, because you would imagine with the majority that they've got 2 terms minimum in power if they... but I guess some of those critical decisions, especially around if anything that would increase the price of gas, especially at this time when we're in this energy
Very
crisis.
difficult, yeah.
And is there a world where my political knowledge is minimal, so if these are stupid questions, please feel free to say. Is there a world where I believe in Norway when they made these decisions, it was kind of cross-party agreements that it doesn't matter who's in power, we're sticking to this. Is there a world where that could happen in the UK? Is our political infrastructure suitable for that to happen?
I think what we saw towards the end of the last Conservative government, I think they actually barked up completely the wrong tree with the narrative and the political pledges that they went down. They were talking about going slower on net zero. They were saying, actually, we're going to remove the obligation for landlords to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. Actually, we're going to scrap some of the heat decarbonisation targets, and actually people from 2035 can keep their gas boiler and things like that. And it didn't pay off for them, obviously. I mean, it was that plus other things that lost them the election. I'm not saying it was all down to their heat pump policy as much as I like to think it would be. But it was a direction that I think was very different to what we'd seen before, because we'd had both major political parties agreeing that, net zero by 2050, we've got to do that. And it'll take all these different steps. We started to see the Conservatives go in a different direction. And obviously they've now got to get a new leader. We don't know who that's going to be yet, but the general consensus is they could go further to the right. And some of the candidates who've already said they want to be leader have said things in the past like, net zero is a bit expensive, isn't it? Not sure we can do it by 2050. So that'll be an interesting dynamic, and it'll be interesting to see what does happen between the two major parties when the new leader's in place. I mean, you think about the journey that the Conservatives went on. We went from having Theresa May, who signed Net Zero 2050 in law as one of her legacy acts just before she left as being Prime Minister. Then we had Boris, who was very keen on big, shiny green infrastructure projects, and he actually was pretty green as a Prime Minister towards people like Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, who were very much not pro-net zero. And we all know what happened in the election where they didn't win despite having changed tack. So we'll have to see what happens with the new leader. But in my opinion, doing things about climate change is a vote winner rather than a vote loser. You just have to look at the public polls to see the evidence for that. So we'll have to see what happens.
I guess it's that point around affordability as well. There's, we've obviously come out of COVID and we've got a big hole in the funds from the supplements that had to be put in place to keep people going through that time. And then when we look at the boiler upgrade scheme as an example, the funds aren't getting deployed as quick as they would like to see more heat pumps going in and more people starting to electrify their homes. But I guess I think it's the Net Zero Innovation Portfolio. We've done a couple of projects in and around that. That's a £1 billion fund to help the country move towards net zero. These things all cost money, and it doesn't feel like there's a huge amount of money going around to be able to make this stuff happen. And if that gets put into taxation and people having to pick up the bill for that, I guess the interest in clean energy and sustainable choices against the increased cost of energy on people's bills, how do we start to separate those things out? Because I think of the manufacturers in this space, some huge names, the likes of Samsung and Mitsubishi, who will all benefit in the UK market from bringing their technology through. And they are, I'm sure, Samsung operating in large onshore wind, Mitsubishi with their heat pump range. They will inadvertently benefit from increased deployment. And you would imagine them coming in and being able to start lobbying to support that. But at the moment, the voice and the noise seems to be stronger from the gas lobbies and the boiler manufacturers. How do we start to change some of that rhetoric? And was that the role that you play?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great thought, because for so long, the oil and gas companies and gas boiler manufacturers, many of which you operate and manufacture in the UK, they've had a very strong market. As we've talked about, 80% of homes being on gas boilers, and obviously the North Sea being a huge part of our energy infrastructure. And they've had lots of lobbying power because they've had this big customer base. I mean, you've got to think about the gas networks as well, people like Cadent in the Northwest and the different ones around the UK. They have billions of pounds worth of assets already existing that depend on natural gas and the status quo remaining. And the writing's on the wall that the status quo is not going to continue forever. So I think that the lobbying that they've done in the past and probably continue to do today will be hugely impactful. I also think when it comes to the other side of things, so the renewable company lobbyists, and as you mentioned, heat pump manufacturers. Actually, a lot of the heat pump manufacturers are also gas boiler manufacturers, and so that they're both a blocker to the transition, but they're also a huge enabler. So getting them on side and getting them to talk more positively about heat pumps is going to have a huge impact, not just on the engineers who install their kit, but also on the engineers that talk to the consumers who then spread through word of mouth to their friends and family. Oh, I've got this new heat pump, it's brilliant. Yeah. It's that sort of thing where at the moment, a lot of the press is focused on negative stories around heat pumps. I mean, there's certain papers in my mind that if you search heat pumps, you'll just be greeted with like a whole plethora of negative heat pump articles. They don't work, or my house was cold, or it's too expensive, and all of that. And you don't really hear from the positive case studies because that doesn't make a news story. Yeah. Sad as it is.
Do you think there's a funded element to that? Is there, if because I have even seen what maybe seem to be portrayed as positive stories, but actually I watched there was a BBC program around a heat pump installation, and it was portrayed as a positive story in terms of this person had gone to a heat pump and it worked, and it kept their home warm, but actually the story itself was £20,000 installation, every single radiator in the home upgraded, the house was torn apart, and it was great once it was done. But actually, when you read behind it, most people look at it and go, "This is not feasible or possible in most homes."
Yeah.
So is there a? Do you think there's the gas markets and the boiler guys, are they funding these stories, do you think?
Well, there was one government minister who was in the last Conservative government, and he specifically said that some of the gas boiler companies who are part of a certain trade association, they were undergoing campaigns of misinformation. And coming from an ex-government minister now, that is pretty powerful. And there was actually an investigation, I think it was written up in The Guardian, about that lobbying power. And one of the trade associations had hired a public relations company, a PR company, to basically quote unquote spark outrage at heat pumps. So if you think you've got all of this money and all of these gas companies, boiler companies, network companies, whoever it is, they've got billions of pounds worth of assets to protect. And so it's worth it for them to put money into campaigns that will not actually stop the transition, because I think it's pretty clear that you're not going to stop it, but just delay it. And we saw these exact tactics with the oil and gas companies themselves, because for a long, long time, they denied climate change was happening and said, oh no, the science is wrong. And then when it became clear there was a very strong scientific consensus that it was happening, they switched from denying it to delaying it and saying, oh, well, we can't really afford to do that, can we? And it's going to be a bit of a hassle, isn't it, to change our economy from being based on oil and gas. And, you only have to watch the TV for a few minutes to see the likes of BP or Shell or one of the other big oil companies sort of promoting their green credentials. And that's a phenomenon that can be called greenwashing, and lots of people will know about that. But we're seeing that also from some of the gas industry, because they'll talk up heat pumps and they'll say, oh yeah, well, we're opening a new, a heat pump manufacturing line somewhere in the UK, or we're training up this many heat pump installers. And actually the reality is, behind closed doors, they might not be saying the same thing to the ministers or to the people who actually hold the power, if you like. They're saying, we can't really afford to do this, and there's not enough of a supply chain to actually install them. And they're just delaying it so that they can sell gas boilers for as long as possible. And then potentially sell all the same people heat pumps later on. So it's one of them where really we need those sorts of people on side to enable the transition to be quicker and to enable those cost decreases so that more people can afford heat pumps, more people can afford to switch, because that will come from a mass market. And we don't have that at the moment in the UK.
No, it's such a shame. And I suppose the most recent example of that would probably be the clean heat market mechanism, and how that kind of came in and went very, very quickly. For those watching that maybe haven't come across that, you'll be able to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the clean heat market mechanism is quite a mouthful, but basically it was a policy that would ensure that, fossil fuel boiler manufacturers, essentially gas boiler manufacturers for the large majority, they would have to sell a certain proportion of heat pumps relative to their gas boiler sales. So in the first year, it was meant to see about 60,000 heat pumps sold. In its second year, it rises to about 90,000, I think. And it was meant to come in April 2024. But the Conservative government at the time was pretty heavily lobbied and said it was worried about what impacts this might have on the price of gas boilers. And that's because the top 4 big boiler manufacturers, they all said that they would have to increase the prices of their boilers to pay for the clean heat market mechanism. Now, lots of analysis showed, and including from the government itself, showed that this probably wasn't going to be the case. But the Conservative government at the time was already rowing back on a lot of net zero measures, and this was one of them. It ended up they were going to delay it for a year, which at one point we thought it could be cancelled altogether. So it was perhaps encouraging to see that some of the internal ministers, and there was one minister in particular, Lord Callanan, who was very pro the clean heat market mechanism. And there was a lot of internal discussion, and they decided to delay it rather than cancel it altogether. And that means that this new government now has that policy basically on Ed Miliband's in tray, and they've delayed it until April 2025. But there's a real risk that the boiler companies pull exactly the same trick. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that, because we know that they want to delay this transition. We know that they're saying these things behind closed doors. It's just whether they want to do that with a new government, and whether they think they're going to be successful. And from what we've seen so far, as we've already talked about, Labour has focused pretty heavily on energy in its first few weeks and month of office. And so I think there's a chance we'll still see it happen in April, but there's also a chance that they'll be successful in lobbying against it again. But I think it's important that we have that long-term trajectory, and we're forcing those gas boiler manufacturers to move towards the future, because unless they start to manufacture heat pumps, we're not going to see cost decreases. We're not going to see that mass market develop.
Yeah, because I think the term that was bandied about was the boiler tax, wasn't it? Once it came into force, and obviously we see a lot of the
it's
boiler
clever marketing, that boiler tax, because no one wants to pay taxes anyway, but especially at the moment, it's people don't want to see that.
And the installers of boilers who were buying them, they were faced with an increased cost, and they were obviously making their customers aware of that, which kind of then started getting customers backs up. So it's a clever in the way they've done it. And
it is clever. And Sky News actually ran a story saying that the boiler manufacturers, the 4 of them that did actually put on the boiler tax, which was their boiler tax, it wasn't the government's boiler tax, it was their boiler tax. They put it onto the, as you say, the installer or the wholesaler who was selling the boiler. And then when they cancelled the fact that they weren't doing it from April 2024 anymore, they'd already collected all of this boiler tax money. And were they able to guarantee it was actually going to go back to the consumer? And I think 3 out of 4 said they either didn't say anything or said they couldn't guarantee it. And then one of the big boiler manufacturers said they were working with their wholesalers and suppliers to return it. And in the cost of living crisis, taking 100 plus from customers and then not giving it back to me is a bit of a disgrace.
Yeah, because I can't imagine the complexity of that mechanism to make it reverse and go back. But if it's put out there as a tax, if that's the terminology people are using, because there was letters that were sent out around it, but it absolutely spiked there was already negativity around heat pumps from boiler installers, and it kind of spiked that, I suppose, touched a pain point, and there was plenty of comments we were getting on the show about whenever we talked positively about heat pumps. But there is an underlying message that we see quite a lot from boiler installers when they comment on the show, which is hydrogen. They say, hydrogen's the future. And I always think, obviously, we're called Heatio. We talk about heat pumps quite a bit. I think that comes mainly from my background and interest in heat pumps. But there are obviously other ways in which people can heat their homes, infrared heating as an example. But where does hydrogen sit in the mix? If we were to take a kind of an unbiased view, because I think when we talk about heat pumps, it's the solution for everybody. But we've got, you mentioned before, we've got Cadent managing their networks, thought processes around potentially injecting hydrogen into those networks, hydrogen-ready boilers. But the little bit I hear about that market is that essentially hydrogen is more expensive to manufacture. It's not a stable material, but I don't know whether that's because I'm hearing the heat pump people saying that. What is the I suppose the independent view on hydrogen?
I think with hydrogen heating, it's becoming clearer and clearer that it's not going to have any major role in heating. There could be a situation in which a very small number of homes are heated with hydrogen. For example, if they're by an industrial base where hydrogen is used for things like steel making or in industrial processes, and then it makes sense for a bunch of houses nearby to also use hydrogen heating. But we've already seen, it was the Conservative government that cancelled the hydrogen town trial. And I think that the smaller pilot up in Fife in Scotland is also being delayed. So it's becoming clearer and clearer that it's not an easy thing to use for heating. And we're also going to have a very limited supply of hydrogen. So we don't really make any of it at the moment through anything that's actually going to be helpful for climate change, because it's all made through natural gas. So unless you start to capture those emissions through carbon capture and storage, or you switch to making green hydrogen, which is using electrolysis to split water into its molecules of hydrogen and oxygen, it's not really a benefit for climate unless we start to move to a different type. And actually, we're going to have a small supply of hydrogen, at least in the short to medium term. And we're going to have to choose pretty carefully where we deploy that hydrogen. So in things that actually need it, like steel making or like in other industrial processes, we don't need it for heating because we've got all of these other solutions that you've mentioned: heat pumps, infrared, electric heating, electric boilers, things like that. We've got all these other solutions that we know work. And we don't know if we're going to get hydrogen to work in the first place. We definitely don't know how much it's going to cost. And we don't know whether it's going to have any net benefit anyway. So it's I think it's fast ruling itself out of being a major player in the heating market. But of course, if you are a gas network, you want to see your network repurposed for something else. You don't just want to see it decommissioned because it's billions of pounds worth. So I'm not surprised that they still lobby for hydrogen heating. And there's some evidence that they've already been lobbying the new government for years and years around hydrogen heating, and still saying it's still a possibility, when I think the independent opinion, there was over 50 academic studies that have said it's not suitable for hydrogen heating in any big way. So it's a weird one, because I think anyone outside of the gas industry doesn't think it's an option, but the gas industry, unsurprisingly, think it's an option.
I always think to myself, when you hear the rhetorics running around about both sides, and obviously coming from a heat pump side, you tend to hear the heat pump enthusiasts saying how it's not going to be a possibility. But then I always think, am I just listening to, is that my algorithm getting that information put to me? What we've actually got a project on at the moment where we've doing it as a bit of a case study for an apartment block where understandably heat pump wasn't a solution for that particular property. And there is always this conversation around if you're in an apartment or a flat and you've got your gas boiler on the wall, you're not in a position where you can go and hang a heat pump outside, and the different options that they have available to them. And this particular project where we're taking them from a gas combi system, and we're putting in infrared heating, we're putting a Sunamp hot water battery and a battery storage system where they can charge from off-peak electricity. So they haven't got solar, so they're not, there's been an apartment block, but we've put a 9.5 kilowatt battery in. They'll charge that during off-peak electricity periods. They'll heat up the hot water storage during those periods, and then obviously use the battery to control the infrared heaters for the rest of the time, along with other appliances in the home. But there does seem, we cover it a lot on this show around the importance of heat pumps, but there is other applications where we can still achieve decarbonisation, we can still achieve electrification, and especially when you bring in these more innovative tariffs to kind of support it. But there does seem to be a lack, outside of Octopus, there seems to be a lack of innovative tariffs on the market. Is that because Octopus are so innovative and they're leading the way? Or is there a reason why the big energy suppliers aren't maybe making these switches? Anything from a political level that's preventing them? Or are they in the same mix with the boiler manufacturers? Are they lobbying against these changes in the market?
Energy suppliers on the whole, I think, are pretty neutral on the future of heating, electrification or whatever else. I think they're pretty neutral on it and don't lobby certainly against electrification. I think that Octopus is a very good example of a company that is a disruptor to the market, as you say, big innovator. And they are introducing a lot of these products. Who knows if the products will stick around? Maybe they'll find there's no demand for them and slowly withdraw them. We don't know quite what's going to happen, but they're certainly the ones to watch when it comes to the future of energy. And I think actually OVO have got a heat pump specific tariff as well now. But we're also seeing some other companies interested in electric vehicle tariffs, and obviously that links more to electrification as well. So I think when it comes to the energy suppliers, they're more waiting to see what the market wants, except for Octopus, who are trying to push the market in a certain way, which is, is great. So I think they'll be driven by demand rather than try and push it from the supply side. But as we've seen over the past couple of years, a lot of the energy suppliers went bust, the smaller ones, and it's been pretty hard for the bigger ones as well, just because they've not been making any money either during the energy crisis, especially if they don't have a generation arm. So that they're in a position where they have a lot of influence over their customers, but perhaps they haven't got, the ability to deliver the same sorts of scale of change that the likes of Octopus are.
Yeah. There was always a question that we got asked was around why would energy suppliers incentivize people to use less energy. You see, I think E.ON are probably one of the biggest in solar installations, Octopus in heat pump installations. Each of those installations has an impact on the amount of energy that they sell to the customer. But there does seem to be a switch towards a more solution type approach.
Yeah.
But I imagine as well, when people are switching to electric vehicles, that's a market where historically, if they were buying fuel from a petrol station, the energy suppliers never saw any benefit from that. So I guess as people start to make these transitions, and maybe is there a more compelling reason for energy suppliers to sell electricity over gas? Or
not that I'm aware of. I think that, the writing's on the wall again. So a lot of the energy companies that we have in the UK are global or at least European. So they've got other arms in other countries that are also facing the same decisions. I think E.ON is a German company maybe, but yeah. So obviously in Germany, they've been phasing out coal, or trying to at least. They've also got a situation where they need to change a lot of the heating that they've got. So it's not like the UK is the only place that's trying to do this transition. I think learning from other countries that these energy companies operate in could actually help us in the UK. There's a few policy changes from government that would be helpful in order to enable more of a transition. So next year, I think we're planning to switch to half-hourly settlement figures, which means that people will have more live energy prices, and that can help with signalling. But as we've already talked about, the signalling of having electricity unit rates, which are much higher than gas unit rates, doesn't signal to the consumer that they should move to electricity. So it's that sort of signalling which can't really be undervalued, because markets do respond to signals, and so do consumers. If it makes economical sense, then a lot of people are going to make that choice, whether or not they're ideologically opposed to net zero or not. If it's cheaper, you're probably going to do it.
I think that's it. We see a lot of people maybe in the kind of early adopter category that have made this transition, and now you're starting to see people that are able to make it on a financial, for their financial situation improves by having it, but you've got to bring in that. You've got to address that capital cost issue for having the technology installed. We're working on an interesting project with E.ON at the moment called Energy as a Service, where we're kind of it's due to go live in September. It's under the Green Homes Finance Accelerator, part of the NZIP portfolio. But essentially, there's no upfront capital cost to the customer to have heat pump, solar, and battery installed, and instead they pay like a monthly fee to essentially, I suppose, lease the technology over a long period of time. Which we hope, when you combine that with the innovative tariffs and the optimization of the system, actually you start to kind of make the financial case a lot stronger for the customer.
Well, I think they do that in Estonia or somewhere. I think it was Estonia, where they've had a huge uptick in the amount of heat pumps being installed, and that's because of a model like Heat as a Service. And especially, like generation I'm in, we all basically lease our mobile phones until the contract. We lease our cars, we pay rent. It's all very monthly now, our expenses, rather than owning something for life, if you like. And I think that model is going to appeal to a lot of people. It won't appeal to everyone, but it'll appeal to a lot of people. And I think a trial like that sounds really interesting. Can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah, it's been an interesting one to work through, because where we find the biggest challenge is the energies, the E.ON have been fantastic in supporting it and bringing it to market. The role we play is we have to essentially do a simulation of the home, taking their energy data, a little bit around how they use the home, and then simulating what the impact of this technology would be to try and give some kind of underwritten assurances around the savings that they'll make. But the biggest challenge has been with the lenders, bringing the lenders to the table to really feel confident in that kind of 20-year funding agreement that's sat behind it. We've been really lucky. We've worked with some amazing ones that have done similar programs around the world. New Zealand is very popular for this kind of approach. But yeah, it's a challenge in itself. So yeah, I think the way that it appears very slow in some areas in the uptake of renewable technologies, mainly focused in the residential space. But is there, if there was any politicians watching now, if you had, what would be your two big changes? What would you ask?
Blimey.
Just two.
Just two. I'd say to Ed Miliband, implement the clean heat market mechanism from April 2025. Be strong about it. Don't give in to lobbying. And also, I actually think the Future Home Standard, which is the new build standards, they're going to have a huge impact, because if you start to see heat pumps installed as standard on new builds, plus things like solar and plus an electric vehicle charger, you're nudging however many 300,000 new homes a year. That's people living in those homes. You're nudging them towards electrification. They're going to spread the word, and we're going to start to see cost decreases, hopefully, as a part of that mass market developing. So I'd say those two things. And the Future Home Standard is interesting because we were meant to have a similar standard back in 2016. Again, the Cameron government scrapped it at the last minute in response to the house builders lobbying pretty strongly. And we've had basically 10 years now of a lack of new build standards being tight and being where they should have been for the time that we're in. So I'd say the Future Home Standard and the Clean Heat Market Mechanism, please. Yeah.
And I was actually up at the Energy House 2 in Salford a couple of days back, and I seen Bellway's built a house in there to the new standard. And it is, it becomes normalised. It's not necessarily a choice you have to make when buying a home. I suppose I wonder how many people, when they're buying a new home, check out what make and model of boilers installed. So actually, it becoming normalised, it just being part of the build process, and it builds confidence.
Builds confidence, builds the supply chains. It's a win-win. It really is.
And with the assurances around kind of NHBC and in fact, if you're having this technology installed, you should have the backing that comes with it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So in the next episode, we're going to touch on maybe some more of the sensitive subjects around energy. I'd like to talk a little bit around kind of the term boiler ban. We've seen some stuff in Germany, for the good and the bad around that, and also how we encourage more people to get into the industry. We touched on just before the show around maybe seeing more people getting into renewable trades and people like yourself getting into the geological side of things. How do we encourage that a bit more? Touch on that in the next episode. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks.